folks. This is the Apologetics Academy. This is a weekly webinar that I run every Saturday. My name is Jonathan McLatchie. You can find the website apologetics-academy.org. And we basically bring on speakers from across the theological spectrum, have them present on a topic of interest to Christians, and then we open up to open floor Q&A, discussion, and dialogue. This evening we have with us Reid Nicewonder, who is well known in the street epistemology community, and he's going to be talking to us about what street epistemology is, and then we're going to be interacting with what he has to say and doing some questioning in the Q&A. So let me, without further ado, just turn over to Reid, if you want to just tell us a bit about who you are, and then just launch into street epistemology. That would be great.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And first off, thank you so much for the invite. This is really cool. I just want to give you huge props to doing this type of thing. It's really great seeing people having these conversations like in this format. It's really cool. So yeah, my name is Reid Nicewonder. I'm an independent filmmaker living out here in Los Angeles, California. And hopefully you can see my screen. That's me in the picture there doing my weekend hobby, which is this thing called street epistemology. For myself, I basically go out to various public parks and places around Los Angeles to just have conversations with people about any type of deeply held belief, something they really think is true. And I use this conversational method, street epistemology, to try to understand the reasons why people believe whatever they believe, and gently question the reliability of those reasons that people give. So to kind of create an opportunity for them to reflect a little bit on the reasons why they believe whatever. And it's kind of the goal of it is just to help people learn to think a little bit more critically. And if people have good reasons for believing whatever they believe, I'd like to believe that as well. And yeah, it's just a lot of fun. So yeah, SE is not so much about academic philosophy. It's more about a conversation. It's a conversational method. Yeah, and epistemology is great, but it's really about how the study of knowledge and how we should come to knowledge, but how we actually do most of our reasoning is an entirely different story, which is kind of what I want to talk about a little bit today. So what I'd like to do for a few minutes is not discuss the epistemology or philosophy behind SE, but the psychology part of it. So hopefully you can see my screen, and I'll just go on to the next slide. First idea I'd like to share today comes from social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. He puts forward in his first book, The Happiness Hypothesis. The main idea in this book deals with how human beings use their reasoning. And I'd like to start things off with a quick story from Benjamin Franklin that Haidt uses to illustrate the central idea from his book quite nicely. So Benjamin Franklin was a vegetarian on principle, and on one long sea crossing, the men he was sailing with were grilling fish, and his mouth started to water. Franklin wrote, "I balanced some time between principle and inclination, till I recollected that when the fish were opened, I saw smaller fish taken out of their stomachs. Then thought I, if you eat one another, I don't see why we mayn't eat you. So I dined upon cod very heartily, and continued to eat with other people, returning only now and then occasionally to a vegetable diet." Franklin concluded, "So convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do." It's a funny little story about the nature of human reasoning, but it actually has quite a lot of evidence to back it up. Here is a paper that was published by Jonathan Haidt back in 2001, which much of his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, is based upon. It's called The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. In the paper, he put forward this idea of the social intuitionist model of moral judgment, or of like human reasoning in general. It very much differs from the rationalist model, as you can see from the top. But all that's very complicated. I encourage anyone watching who is interested to read the paper, but Haidt made it much more clear in his book using a clever metaphor. So yeah, all that is very complicated with Jonathan Haidt's Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tale paper, but he made things much more easy to read and understand using his metaphor in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, and that metaphor is the elephant and the rider. So we assume that our mind is one thing, but we actually have a divided mind, two parts, an elephant and a rider. The rider is the conscious mind with its rational functions and volitional power, but the elephant is everything else, all the internal presuppositions, genetic inclinations, subconscious motives, and layers upon layers of uninterrogated, raw experience. Needless to say, the elephant is bigger and more powerful than the rider. So reason and emotion are not separate. They are intrinsically linked. Our intuitions come first and our strategic reasoning second. And here are a few quotes from Haidt. When you refute a person's argument, does she generally change her mind and agree with you? Of course not, because the argument you defeated was not the cause of her position. It was made up after the judgment was already made. In moral arguments, the writer goes beyond being just an advisor to the elephant. He becomes a lawyer, fighting in the court of public opinion to persuade others of the elephant's point of view. The writer can't just decide to change and then order the elephant to go along with the program. Lasting change can only come by retraining the elephant, and that's hard to do. Most of the time when we take a position, we look for evidence that supports it. And if we find some evidence, enough so that our position makes sense, we stop thinking. But at least in a low pressure situation, if someone else brings up reasons and evidence on the other side, people can be induced to change their minds. They just don't make an effort to do such thinking for themselves. Over and over again, studies show that people set out on a cognitive mission to bring back reasons to support their preferred belief or action. And because we are usually successful in this mission, we end up with the illusion of objectivity. We really believe that our position is rationally and objectively justified. So what we do with SE is try and provide that low pressure environment to create an opportunity for people to reflect on their reasoning. So if we want to reason effectively, we need each other. We need people to talk to so that they can point out how we may be getting things wrong. And we need to do this in a way that does not upset our elephants so that our riders can have the chance to genuinely reflect. So today I'd like to do my best to live up to this quote from John Stuart Mill, one of my favorites. He who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may be able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either opinion. Nor is it enough that he should hear the opinions of adversaries from his own teachers presented as they state them and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. So yeah, I'm just here to listen and try and learn some things. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reid. If anyone would like to ask a question, then now's the time. You can submit it using the Q&A button, or you can click the raise hand button as well and interact that way. If not, I will ask questions. We have do you want to just to give people an example of street epistemology? I know it's not really a sort of regular situation because I know what street epistemology is already, and I'm an apologist. But do you want to? Because I saw your advice that you gave to Doug on his attempt at doing street epistemology on me. Would you like to have a go at doing that? See how that goes, or do you not feel comfortable doing that?
I don't know. It seems like we're in such a strange situation where we're totally I think we see each other as such, on such different sides that we can try and do it, but I mean, based on like what I know about, this model I put forward about, having the elephant in the writer, I think it's going to be very hard to find some genuine reflection, but we can see how it goes.
Okay.
And whatever you want to do.
Sure. Let's just see how it goes. I'd be interested to see what, because I know Doug's watching and Anthony Magnabosco's watching as well. So it'd be interesting to get your, to see whether you would, how you would do it differently from the way Douglas did it.
Okay. So any other questions before we get into that? Or just want to get into it?
Anonymous attendee asks, Reid, can street epistemology be used on any belief, including the belief that God does not exist? If so, how would that work?
Yeah, I've done that a couple times with people who have sat down at my table and put forward the idea that God does not exist. I do it pretty much the same way. I ask them why they believe that and what the reasons are and if those reasons are reliable. So it could work just as well on a belief like that. And all right. Well, anything else about?
Okay, let's try the street epistemology thing, and then we'll see if there's any more questions.
Okay. So first, I like to get people's sense of confidence about their belief, preferably on a scale, from 0 to 100. 0 being, no confidence at all, like all doubt about it, and 100%, like completely sure, absolutely certain. Where do you think you would find yourself in that scale?
Normally, I'd want to ask you to calibrate the scale. Sure. Like I did with Douglas, and I prefer it calibrated in view of some historical events, such as say Caesar crossing the Rubicon or something like that, because we are dealing with historical truth claims when it comes to Christianity.
How about a scale of like when I drop something, it falls? That would be 100%, or like virtually 100%.
Yeah, I think it's better to compare it to an historical event such as Caesar crossing the Rubicon, which is a similar event that can be investigated like the resurrection.
Is there anything that you're like more confident about from like history? Like I want it to be like a more general confidence level.
So the resurrection is about as confident as I can get from looking at historiographical evidence. Yeah. So,
do you believe anything more strongly than that? Anything?
No. Well,
like not based in history, but like
okay. So I believe that I exist more strongly than that because I think there's a 100%. I'm absolutely certain that I exist, whereas I'm sure beyond reasonable doubt that Christianity is true.
Okay, so 100% for you exist.
Yeah.
And anything else we learn?
Right. I'm 100% sure also that 2 + 2 = 4, whereas right. I'm sure beyond reasonable doubt that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. I'm sure beyond reasonable doubt that Jesus rose from the dead, etc.
Beyond a reasonable doubt for those things.
Yeah.
So just like virtually certain for the other things.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay. So now I know your confidence. Can we just talk about the existence of a God, or do you want to talk about some specific thing of history?
We can talk about the resurrection if you want.
The resurrection? Okay. And what would you say is like the main reason why you believe the resurrection happened?
The evidence for the post-resurrection appearances, and that we have multiple independent attestation for those. Their polymodal character, they involve not just sight, but group conversation, touching, eating with, etc., being extended across 40 days, so it's not one brief and confusing episode. The fact that the claims concerning the resurrection appearances can be traced back to the apostles themselves, and the fact that the apostles who claimed this were willing to die for that belief.
Okay, let me try and repeat back what I heard you say. Try and get it clear. So there's just multiple lines of evidence, independent sources of evidence, and these multiple sources can be traced back to people who claim that they would die for their belief.
Correct.
Okay. And you said something like paramodal. I'm not sure what that means.
Polymodal. So I said that it
Polymodal.
Right. So the resurrection appearances were not just individual sightings, but in fact group sightings, and they involved group conversation, eating alongside, physical contact with, etc.
After the resurrection, people had different experiences of Jesus.
Correct.
That's what that means. Okay. All of these different claims or all the different lines of evidence come from this book called the Bible, and they are basically a kind of eyewitness testimony type of thing.
Right. Well, the Bible's not one book, obviously, but 66 different books. The New Testament is 27 different books, and these are historical sources. And we have good evidence for its substantial reliability of the Gospels and Acts and the Epistles of Paul, which are relevant to our particular question here.
Okay, so it's not just one book, it's a bunch of different books, and all of these books are historical sources, and these historical sources are reliable accounts of what actually happened.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. And without all of these different books, without all of these different sources, like if you had to just kind of like partition them from your mind and set them to the side, what would remain of your confidence about this event happening?
So basically, if we were to throw out all the evidence for it?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
So it's like asking, okay, so what would happen to my confidence that Abraham Lincoln existed if we just tossed out all the evidence for Abraham Lincoln? Well, I wouldn't have any confidence if we tossed out all the evidence.
Great. So it's all down to the evidence for you.
Yeah.
Cool. And okay. So let me think. What's like the best example of this event happening?
The best example? You mean the best example of evidence for it happening?
Yeah, the best piece of evidence.
It's more a cumulative case. It's the fact that we have such a numerous lines of evidence which independently converge on that as the best conclusion. But I find particularly intriguing, for instance, the martyrdom of James, the half-brother of Jesus. And we have good evidence, I would argue, that James was a skeptic during Jesus' lifetime, and yet shortly after the resurrection of Jesus, James became a Christian, and in fact, we learn he becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church. And according to Josephus, James was willing to die as a martyr for his faith in Christ. And so I like to ask the skeptic, how much would it take to convince you that your elder brother was the God of Israel to the point of martyrdom? Something pretty radical. So that there's one example of evidence for the resurrection.
Okay, let me try and recap that. So James's half-brother, he was a skeptic about it, but then he actually saw Jesus when he came back, and that caused him to become a Christian. And this event was also like independently confirmed by Josephus later.
Josephus mentions his martyrdom, which is not in the Gospels or Acts, and also independently documented by Hegesippus in the 2nd century, as quoted by Eusebius.
Josephus mentions James's martyrdom?
Yeah, in volume 20 of Antiquities of the Jews, yes.
Involving 20 other people?
No, I said in volume 20 of Antiquities of the Jews.
20.
Yeah.
Okay. So, gotcha. Yeah, all these stories and claims from the Bible, they claim something pretty remarkable that a person came back from the dead. At least for me, I wonder how I could be, how I could be so sure something happened that extraordinary in history based on those kinds of evidence, like the basically just testimony from people back then. Are those is testimony even in this amount of quality and quantity a reliable way to come to this high degree of confidence in this event actually being true?
Testimony is accepted or not on a case-by-case basis, and in regards to the resurrection, I think we have very good eyewitness testimony. We have, I think we can argue very strongly that the Gospels and Acts are based on the testimony of eyewitnesses, and that those eyewitnesses were habitually truthful and reliable.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that we have all of these accounts that account as very good eyewitness testimony for this event.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And eyewitness testimony, if you found out, like, to your satisfaction that eyewitness testimony was not as reliable as you currently believe it to be, would that change your confidence in this?
If this particular eyewitness testimony was not as reliable as I believed it to be, would that change my confidence? Is that the question?
Yeah, as eyewitness testimony as a way of coming to this degree of confidence in this belief, like eyewitness testimony as a way to know this is true.
Well, as I said, it's a case-by-case basis. So in some instances, eyewitness testimony is not reliable. And studies have shown that eyewitness testimony is particularly unreliable on details in cases where events happen very quickly over a period of seconds or minutes, or where the participants are strangers to one another, or where there's a weapon present, such as a knife or a gun. So there are cases where eyewitness testimony is not reliable. But I would argue that the eyewitness testimony in the case of the resurrection of Jesus is reliable by virtue of the fact that the sightings weren't just individual sightings, but group sightings, and involved group conversation, eating with, physical contact with, etc. So if it came to my attention that the eyewitness testimony of the Gospels was not reliable, yes, that would lower my confidence.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Explain that to me. I think I understand. So what makes the eyewitness testimony in the Bible of sufficient quality for you is that it's individual sightings, a bunch of them, and there's also some group sightings together. It's not something that is something that would happen really quickly, or not something that happened in like a stressful situation. It's just a normal, regular type of situation where people could have their wits about them, kind of like that.
So we have good reason to think that the Gospels are based on the testimony of eyewitnesses, and there's numerous lines of evidence for that. One of my favorite ones is the evidence from undesigned coincidences, both between the Gospels and between the Gospels and external secular sources. But there's also a whole array of other evidences, and there's plenty of good scholarly works that have been written on that subject.
Undesigned coincidences. What do you mean by that?
So an undesigned coincidence is when you have two accounts that describe an event and they interlock in a way that's unexpected if the story is being made up, or if one is copying from the other, or if both are copying from a common source. So to give an example, in John chapter 6, we have the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, and Jesus turns to Philip to say, where should we send these people to buy bread? Which raises the question in the audience's mind, why does Jesus turn to Philip in particular? Because Philip's a fairly minor character in the Gospels. If what was interesting is that if you flip over to John 12, 6 chapters later, in a completely unrelated part of John's Gospel, and John mentions that Philip is from the town called Bethsaida, whereas in Luke's account of the feeding of the 5,000, in Luke chapter 9, he doesn't mention Jesus turning to Philip, it just says he spoke to the disciples, but it does mention that the event took place in Bethsaida. And so now, by putting the pieces together, we have a cogent explanation for why Jesus turns to Philip in John 6, verse 5, because Philip's a local person, knows where the shops are to buy bread. And there's dozens upon dozens of those crisscrossing. Go ahead.
Sorry, it's just a lot there.
Yeah.
Could you like break that down a little more simply for me?
So basically, you have you have something in John, which is then explained by looking at another part of John plus looking at part of Luke, the parallel account in Luke chapter 9. So you have the question in John 6, why does Jesus turn to Philip to ask where to send the people to buy bread? We have the puzzle piece in John 12 that Philip's from Bethsaida. We have another puzzle piece in Luke 9, which says that the event of the feeding of the 5,000 took place in Bethsaida. So by putting the pieces together like a jigsaw, we can see why Jesus turns to Philip, because Philip's a local person. That's a kind of pattern that's very unexpected in a story that's being made up, but is expected in history.
Okay, so there's just some unexpected patterns that line up in these different testimonies that kind of, if it was made up, you wouldn't expect those patterns?
Right.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. Well, let me think for a second. Yeah, if we found some type of situation where we had a group of people experience something, like together and individually, like, is there anything that people use these reasons for that they use to believe something else to be true that is actually something we don't think is true? I'm trying to figure out if these reasons, it's just so many of them, like so many different kinds. It's hard to do it. Hard to take it one by one.
Sure. You'd have to give me an example, and then we could look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, maybe like an example, like UFO sightings. Seems like we have eyewitness testimony from people, both individually, a bunch of them, and maybe some like groups of people believing that we like UFOs visited the Earth. And if we found out there's some like undesigned coincidences like matching these different testimonies, could we use those reasons to be justified in believing something like that?
In principle, but you said that if we found undesigned coincidences that were compelling, well, sure, in principle, but I don't think that's ever happened, and you would need to show me examples of that. Now, people, of course, have claimed UFO experiences and sightings, but you would also need to demonstrate in the case of those testimonies that these are individuals who are habitual truth tellers, that their eyewitness testimony is reliable, and that it's on par with the gospel testimony. And to my knowledge, that isn't the case. At least I haven't seen that.
Yeah, it seems like we could find people alive today that claim to have seen these types of things. Like, and is having like an alive witness better than having dead ones?
So there's, with the gospel accounts and with the accounts concerning the resurrection, we know that the alleged witnesses of the resurrection were at least sincere in their belief, because they were willing to die for that belief, and various other reasons as well, which indicates to me that they were at least sincere, so they're not deliberately setting out to deceive people. So the next question becomes, okay, so how did they come to that sincere belief? And the best explanation is, of course, I think the resurrection. In the case of the UFO sightings, you would need to show that they were sincere in their belief, so they're not just making stuff up, and also you would need to show that they're that the sighting was that which is not likely to be explained as something routine or normal.
Okay, so we know they were sincere because they were willing to die, and like there's just, when we assume they were sincere because of that, is there any other explanation that's possible? We could, like, what's this? Is there any other explanation you've heard of that could explain why they could be sincere besides that?
Well, you can submit an explanation. So far, I haven't seen any that are convincing. I mean, people like Gerd Ludemann and Paula Fredrickson and others who accept that the disciples sincerely believed that they'd experienced resurrection appearances try to attribute those to hallucinations or visions or something along those lines. And my response to that is, first of all, as I said earlier, is extended across a 40-day period. So it's not just one brief and confusing episode. And also, as I said, it's polymodal character involving not just sight, but group conversations, etc.
Okay. Maybe like one way I could think of it is like these are just kind of stories that people have put together, and that maybe it's not entirely historical. Maybe it's kind of more of just like just a story that kind of tries to tell like a morality tale or some type of, mythological story. Like that's one way I could think some characters in this story could seem to be sincere and be willing to die. Like it's hard to tell if it's actually happened, at least for me.
But when we look at the sources, we see, as I said earlier, internal evidences for its verisimilitude and also its interlocking with external sources. So these accounts are not mythological in character, they're historical in nature, that the gospel authors intended to communicate real history and that they were very good at doing so. That's what the evidence suggests to me.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I think I know where you're coming from. Got a bunch of different lines of evidence. It's really about the historical evidence about it. So great. I think I understand. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Okay. Joshua says, late question, sorry. Hi, Reid. Do you believe that consistent application of SC to one's own beliefs will inevitably lead to atheism or agnosticism, or could it possibly lead to theism?
It could possibly lead to theism if we really look into the evidence and trying to subject it to some scrutiny. But currently, I believe it would lead to one not believing in like a theistic God for sure. Okay. I think you're muted, Jonathan.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Tim says, I would be interested to hear what persuades Reid that atheism is the most reasonable position to take. It might be a question for later in the discussion.
It's like I kind of see atheism as just the default position about it, and then I haven't found any reliable ways to conclude that a God exists. So it's just like it's kind of like the null hypothesis for me. It's not so much like a positive belief. It's just the default.
Mm-hmm. I had a question. I often see in your street epistemology interviews that you say, you ask the question, is faith a reliable method for coming to a belief? Mm-hmm. And I've never understood faith as a method for coming to a belief. Faith is a response to a belief, right? I have belief in a doctor. I have a belief that an airplane pilot is able to take me to my destination, and so I respond by exercising faith in that individual, right?
So it's like a kind of trust.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, some people use faith in that way, and I would say I would have kind of that type of trust or faith in those type of situations.
Okay, but that seems to be the way that the Bible talks about faith, and it seems to be the way that the early church understood faith. And so it seems that street epistemologists often misrepresent what Christians mean by faith when they ask that question, is faith a reliable method? Because it's not a method at all, right?
Yeah, I try in my conversations to like never mention faith at all unless they bring it up. And then I try to immediately ask what they mean by it. And then I ask if whatever they say, and it's very common, people will say, belief without evidence or knowledge without evidence, that type of thing. So I don't know where they're getting that from, if that's actually from like the biblical stance. So I question the reliability of like that meaning whenever that comes up.
Mm-hmm. Anonymous attendee asks, Reid, is there an historical figure that you believe existed before photography, videography, etc.? How certain are you on a scale of 1 to 100 of this person's existence? What is the best piece of evidence for this person's existence?
A historical figure?
Yeah.
When does that start? Like,
I guess
being historical.
I guess you get to pick one.
I think your common example was like Abraham Lincoln, that type of thing.
Sure.
I'm like virtually certain he was real, like beyond a reasonable doubt. So like 99% confident. And what is the best piece of evidence for this person's existence? Like, I'm not a historian at all, so I don't know what like the quality of evidence is, but like a painting of him, or maybe like some of his writings with his signature, or like other physical pieces of evidence that he had, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. Maybe even like hair that was like left in his clothes. Could we do like DNA tests on that? I don't know. Something like that. That'd be interesting.
Anonymous attendee asks, Reid, as it pertains to your own epistemology, are you a foundationalist or coherentist?
I'm not like a professional academic, like epistemologist for sure. Like, I only know a little bit about it. It's the types of conversations I have rarely go into like these type of detail. I'm not quite sure. I think like foundationalist, like having reasons, like going all the way back, like down to a foundation. I'm not sure we can get there. I think there's like the idea of brute facts. Like, we just have to find some presuppositions and go with those. I would think we go with those tentatively, to like kind of create our own models and then test those models to see if they correspond with reality. So I think that's how I go about it.
Anonymous attendee asks, Reid, how certain are you that the physical world exists and that you aren't living in a simulation similar to the movie The Matrix? How reliable do you believe your sensory experience is and that you aren't in a dream right now? What pieces of evidence would you give? How certain are you of these pieces of evidence?
Yeah, it's like another one of those common examples in epistemology where it's like hard skepticism, like there's like no way to know if we're actually not in a simulation. It's like that could be true, and it could be true that my own senses are just part of the simulation, and then I'm not like actually real. Like, I think I'm real. I think I'm pretty sure I'm real. So it's just kind of like another one of those default positions. If we have good reason to falsify that, then we can then question that assumption. But like, I see no reason to think that.
Will McCarroll says, Reid, good talk. I'd like to think about your idea of commitment riding on prior decisions that came from varying rational rigor, elephant and rider. Unfortunately, it went by so quickly that I didn't fully get it. It seems that approach cuts both ways, but it provides a good framework for dialogue. I can wait for Jonathan's video post, but do you have these thoughts written out, including the J.S. Mill quote? Thanks.
It does cut both ways. I see as like myself as a very flawed human being. I think, I don't know everything. I try to be humble in what I claim to know. I always try to say that I could be wrong about things. So, and then I see the elephant and the rider as a great way to be humble and to see that what I believe is really based on kind of unconscious intuition, and I post hoc reason my way into what I feel to be true. So, like, a great way to actually kind of reason and find out what's true is to talk to each other and try to do it in a productive, friendly way and to figure out those reasons.
Mm-hmm. Tim asks, I would be interested to hear what persuades Reid that atheism is the most reasonable position to take. Are any of these videos, SE with Atheists, available online?
There is one with a lady who was like on the verge of being an atheist. I'm not sure there's one like an explicit atheist because it's like the conversations go pretty quickly. But I'll try and find something. I have a whole backlog of videos I still need to upload, but I don't think I have one that this person is thinking of that would demonstrate that to at least to what I think he's trying to find.
Great. Let's see. Anonymous attendee asks, Reid, in the past you've dismissed arguments such as undesigned coincidences by saying they use the Bible to support the Bible. How does your objection make sense in light of the fact that scholars regularly look for internal marks of truth to help verify the credibility of all kinds of allegedly historical documents, even secular ones?
They look for internal marks of truth to help verify the credibility. I don't know what that means. Internal marks of truth.
So I gave an example earlier, if you recall.
Yeah, what was that again?
That was the one with the feeding of the 5,000 and Philip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I see from that is like, I'm not a historian of the Bible or like a scholar at all. So for me, it's just like a story. And like the person who wrote that story could have just made it up or wrote it down for other reasons. Like I would believe a bunch of those people were there if they signed their names to a document saying, hey, I was here, I saw this, here's my signature. But just going off someone's testimony that happened, especially for like an extraordinary event, like someone coming back from the dead, it's just not something I would find to be credible.
Okay. Anonymous attendee asks, I'm curious, Reid, can you explain what reliable way you use to conclude that atheism is a default position?
I think Russell's teapot is like the philosophical example of this. It's like the default position is that there's no Russell's teapot. There could be, but like my default position is that there's not a teapot, going around this one of the Saturns of Jupiter, one of the moons of Jupiter, I think. So whatever reason people could use for claiming that to be the default is what I would use for this.
Cool. Callum says, hi, I know this seems to be a thorny semantic issue with how atheism is defined nowadays, but how would you differentiate agnosticism and the null hypothesis, or are they the same?
How would you differentiate the agnosticism and the null hypothesis? Agnosticism is just like I don't claim to know a God does not exist. It's just I really don't think about it that much at all. Like I don't. Even for things I do claim to know very confidently, I don't claim to know they are true absolutely. So I like to be agnostic about pretty much everything. It's just a way to be a little bit more humble in that way. And I just answered about the null hypothesis.
Okay. Chris asks, what evidence would you accept to say God exists? Basically, what evidence would it take for you to be a God believer?
Probably some type of miracle or something like that. I think some people claim like people to be healed from prayer, some type of like amputee getting their limb back, that type of thing. When people pray for something, so that, along those types of evidence.
But when you're doing your street epistemology interviews, you don't accept that as a reliable way of concluding the belief is true, because people do in your videos claim to have witnessed or experienced miracles, right?
Yeah, I believe that they had an experience. I don't know if their experiences were actually caused by what they think it was caused by.
So how would you know if you experienced a miracle that it was caused by what you think it was caused by?
If it was under scientific testing conditions, if it was controlled in some way, so that I could be confident that I wasn't being fooled.
Okay. I'm just curious how you would test the supernatural in an empirical way, but
yeah, it's a tough question. I know that James Randi did $1 million challenge for a while, like letting people submit their supernatural abilities, where they would try to test them, and it would be along those lines.
Okay. Anonymous attendee asks, Reid, what would you say to someone who points to the lack of training in proper epistemology as a way to undermine the reliability of street epistemology?
Someone points to the lack of training. Well, street epistemology is just a way to have a conversation, like epistemology in the name, but we're not claiming to be like pro epistemologists, like in terms of the philosophy sense. We're just people trying to figure out what's true, and it doesn't have to be about these types of like academic terms. Like just for everyday type of claims, it works for that as well. So, and I think the more a person knows, like I think the better street epistemology they would be. So I would love to try to understand ways to be better in that way. So
Cameron Bertuzzi asks, what are your thoughts on belief in God as a properly basic belief in the context of Reformed epistemology?
Yeah, that's another one of those like brute facts type of thing, properly basic. Like, yeah. I view God as not as an entity, but as a set of ideas, specifically a set of ideas to allow someone to meet their own psychological and social needs. And one of those needs is a need for attribution. And one of those categories of attribution is the phenomenological attribution. Mm-hmm. So it's like they use God as a kind of post hoc reason to give attribution to things, mainly for morality and meaning and purpose, but part of it as well is just like the existence of the universe and stuff like that. So I see people using the idea of God to give people that type of meaning. So it's the time to believe something is when there's evidence for it, and I don't see evidence for God.
Okay. You don't see any evidence for God?
Not any evidence that is sufficient.
Okay. Because that's an important philosophical nuance, right? Between no evidence and sufficient evidence.
Yeah, right. For sure.
Anonymous attendee asks, is your primary purpose for doing SC to talk people out of their religious faith? Peter Boghossian wrote that in his book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, and also said that to Sam Harris during an interview, assuming you would agree.
That's what it originally was, yeah. Street epistemology was for talking people out of their faith, out of their belief in this supernatural type of idea of a God. But I think it's now branched out to just be a more general critical thinking tool.
Okay. Vladimir Susik asks, Reid did not fully respond to Tim's question. Why does he think that atheism is the most rational position to take?
In the same way of like Russell's teapot. It's just that I see it as the default position. I don't, if any reason given, I don't see it as sufficient reason to believe. based on, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I don't see any extraordinary evidence to sufficiently believe in a God.
Cool. Anonymous attendee asks, you frequently mention the extraordinary nature of the Bible's claims. David Hume famously said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which seems to underpin your thinking. Are you familiar with philosopher John Earman's response to Hume or miracles?
No, I haven't. That'd be interesting to look into.
Richard Suttles asks, Reid, Jonathan Haidt also has a lecture about the rationalist delusion, where he critiques atheists that he calls new atheists like Dawkins and Harris for thinking people can achieve pure reason. Do you think atheists are just as vulnerable in forming a group where they see themselves as intellectually and morally superior? In other words, can atheists fall to the same problem as religious people when it comes to overestimating reason and underestimating their biases?
I totally agree with Jonathan Haidt on that point. I see new atheists as very arrogant sometimes, and that atheism can be seen in the way Jonathan Haidt defines a religion as like a moral community, like a set of ideas that binds people together. He talks more about it in his other book, The Righteous Mind. So new atheists or atheists in general can and do create atheism to be a kind of religion or a thing like a religion.
Callum asks, just to follow up on Chris's question, would you allow for the possibility that the laws of nature are not exceptionless regularities, so a miracle is on the table? You could also dodge miracles no matter how well evidenced by clinging to an exceptionless view of laws.
Let me read that again. You allow a possibility. Can also dodge somehow. I'm not quite sure what he means. I think he means even if a miracle did happen, I could dodge that by saying, I'm not sure exactly what he's saying. I'm kind of haven't had lunch yet. My brain's getting a little tired. Just so many questions. But if it was under control testing conditions, my confidence would be raised. I wouldn't be absolutely sure to be the case, but my confidence would be raised sufficiently if I saw a miracle like that.
Mm-hmm. Anonymous attendee asks, how would street epistemology be considered a conversation? Is the aim truly to learn or persuade someone away from their view?
Yeah, it's a conversational method. It's a tool for people to use to have conversations. It's a way of talking with people about their deeply held beliefs. And the aim really depends on the person. I think originally street epistemology was for talking people out of their faith, but I use it to really try and fulfill the John Stuart Mill quote, trying to learn why people believe things so that I may hear it from their own mouths. So, and if they have good reasons, I would love to believe whatever's true. I just find it to be a really nice and effective way to find the core reasons why people believe.
Vladimir Susik asks, would it be fine if I came up to examine Reid's reasons for rejecting the modal ontological argument?
Maybe some other time. You can contact me and we can do a live stream on my channel if you want.
Okay. Anonymous attendee says, you referred to street epistemology as a critical thinking tool. The goal is to try to examine our epistemic practices, but street epistemology seems like an epistemic practice in itself. It consists, for instance, of one person adopting the role of interrogator and the other person passively answering questions without asking any in return. My worry would be that this leads to a one-sided epistemic practice that privileges the interrogator over the other person. Do you think that this one-sidedness might lead both parties to only critically examine one side of the issue and thereby itself be a bad epistemic practice?
Yeah, it's a great criticism for myself. And you can see this in a lot of my videos that I pretty much leave it open for anyone to ask whatever they want of me and my own views. Like when they do, I try to answer as honestly as I can. So I try to make it a little bit more of a conversation than a straight up interview. So hopefully that answers that.
Mm-hmm. Someone also added that the book by Ehrman is Human's Abject Failure, so you might want to look into that.
I'll write that down. Thanks.
Tim B says, you claim that atheism is the default position. Do you believe that the prior probability of atheism is high? If so, what are your reasons for concluding this? It seems to me that atheism is intuitive. Multiple independent scientific studies have shown that God's beliefs are instinctive for humans. In the absence of additional reasons to believe, why should we doubt our intuitions?
Cool. Yeah, atheism is the default position because let me go back to that. Okay, I got it. No worries. I see it now.
Yep.
Yeah, it's the default position in the same way, like we don't believe in Russell's teapot or fire-breathing dragons, that type of thing. Whatever reason you would give for those things, that's why atheism is the default position. Mainly because we haven't seen a god or observed one. And in terms of theism being intuitive, like the universe was here first, it has no obligation to be intuitive to us in the nature it has. And there's a bunch of evolutionary reasons why we have evolved to have an idea of a god so readily available. It's based on argument by group selection, which Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about in both his books, The Happiness Hypothesis and The Righteous Mind.
Okay. Anonymous attendee says, Reid, are there beliefs we can hold without evidence, like believing that we will wake up tomorrow?
Are there beliefs we can hold without evidence, like believing that we will wake up tomorrow? Well, would that be an example of that?
I mean, I don't think the belief that we'll wake up tomorrow is a particularly good example, because we do have evidence that we'll wake up tomorrow because we are in good health, right? We wake up every morning. So, and in the absence of evidence that we are in poor health, then we have, it's not proof that we'll wake up tomorrow, but it's good evidence nonetheless that we'll wake up tomorrow. A better example might be that the material world exists, which isn't something that we have evidence for, because we need to assume that our sensory experiences are reliable ways of interacting with the material world. So,
yeah, I think the movie Inception kind of deals with this problem really well. Like by the end of it, it's like, is he in a dream? Is he not? It's kind of just like, whatever. If we're in a dream or a simulation, that's fine. It's like we can still have meaning in our lives if we, it's all about. There's Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about having meaning. Like meaning is in between. Like we make our own meaning through relationships and work and all that. I would totally recommend the book.
Callum says, SE asks for reasons for belief and correctly upholds reason itself. With that in mind, I would be interested in your opinion on the argument for reason.
The argument for reason, I think it's like a pragmatic argument. Like the more true things we believe and the fewer false things we believe, the better we can kind of manipulate reality to use it as a tool for our own ends, like to be able to do things, and ultimately to like lower the amount of unnecessary suffering and maximize the well-being of people or conscious creatures. That's how I would go about it, at least.
Cameron Bertuzzi says, to follow up on the question of Reformed epistemology, Alvin Plantinga has famously argued that belief in God can be rational and warranted apart from argumentation. He responds to the charge of wish fulfillment by saying that God, if such a being exists, could use an innate desire for the transcendent to reliably engender belief in God. And if most people come to believe in God on that basis, it would be reliable by definition. What are your thoughts on that?
Innate desire for the transcendent to reliably engender belief in God. Yeah, our innate desire has nothing to do with what's actually true. Like a lot of people could be desire. Like I desire a lot of things. Like there's a quote in Star Wars, like Han Solo says, "Well, I can imagine quite a bit." So I think we need better reasons, or we need some type of way of not fooling ourselves when it comes to beliefs like this. 'Cause it seems to be a lot of people believe a lot of things just because they have some innate desire about it.
Right. Joshua says, Reid, do we believe there is no teapot because it's a default belief, or because it's unlikely for some country to fire a teapot into space such that it orbits a planet?
I mean, I guess. Sure.
Vladimir Susik asks, what modal ontological argument demonstrates that if God is possible, he must exist in the actual world according to modal logic? Would you mind giving us your opinion of such an argument?
You might have to break that down with me at some other time. I'm not sure what that means.
Okay, and that's all the questions that were submitted.
Cool. Well, I've enjoyed this. It's been really fun.
Yes, likewise. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, no problem. And hope to chat again some other time.
Yeah, what is it you do, by the way, as a profession? Curious.
Mostly do some like assistant editing or some camera work every now and then. A movie I worked on last year just came out on iTunes called Escape Room.
Okay.
I was the post-production supervisor on that. So
awesome.
Okay. If you guys need, I know Halloween has just passed, but if you want a cool kind of suspenseful scary movie, you can check that out.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll send you the link to this recording when I have it up on YouTube. But thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And yeah, people can reach me at my YouTube channel or Facebook or Twitter. And if you want to do any more chats, feel free to contact me.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.